Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Bara Vaida. I'm the beat leader on infectious disease issues for the AHCJ. This is one of a series of webinars focused on timely health topics in the news to help you with your coverage. And today's topic is food safety. If you want to get a little worried about the food that we're eating, take a look at the FDA food recall site. In the past 6 weeks, the FDA recalled food from at least a dozen companies that included frozen fruit, fresh produce, flour, and powdered infant formula because of contamination from Salmonella, Listeria, E. coli, and a rare but deadly bacteria called Chronobacter sakazaki. And unfortunately, many times recalls only happen after people have gotten sick. And data from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention tells the story. 1 in 6 Americans, about 48 million people, are poisoned by food every year. Of those, about 128,000 wind up in the hospital and 3,000 die. So why is that? And what stories can reporters be writing to do something about this? To help us put these questions into context and to offer some story ideas is today's speaker, Bill Marler, who's one of the nation's best known food safety lawyers in the country. He became nationally known in 1993 when there was an E. coli outbreak connected to undercooked hamburger meat at the Jack in the Box restaurants in California, Washington State, and it ultimately killed several children. He's represented families that have sued that chain and others over the years. He became part of a movement to raise awareness about the vulnerabilities in our food system and to push for food safety reform. And Marion Nestle is a really well-known author and food policy expert by many folks in this field, says that everybody knows if you have a food poisoning problem, Bill Marler is the person you go to. And if I were a food company, I'd be terrified of Bill because he usually wins. In 2009, Bill founded Food Safety News, an online publication that has nearly 50,000 subscribers and provides detailed food safety news. It's one of the few outlets out there that exists that covers this topic in great detail. And so if you're looking to get up to speed on food safety issues, I highly recommend you check out Food Safety News. So Bill will offer about 15 minutes of presentation, and then the next 30 minutes or so we'll answer your questions. You can ask the questions at any time by typing them in that Q&A a box. So don't put them in the chat section, put them in the Q&A section, and then we'll direct them to Bill when that Q&A point begins. So we'll get started here. Bill, thank you so much for being here today, and go ahead and start sharing your screen.
Great, thanks. Thanks a lot, Bara. So it's great to be with you, and I've been, as I talked to you earlier, it's been the 30th year of post Jack in the Box, and a lot of people have been not only covering the Jack in the Box story 30 years later, but I think also it helps sort of frame where food safety has come and gone over the last 30 years, and I think it's been really helpful. But I think it'd be helpful for your listeners and watchers to sort of get a kind of go down memory lane of food safety at Jack in the Box. Once, it was a very long time ago. That was me the summer before the Jack in the Box outbreak happened, and it's amazing how better looking I am today than I was 30 years ago. I think one of the things, Marion's right. In fact, I do win all the time. And the reason why I do that is there's the concept of what's called strict product liability. Food is a product. We don't necessarily sometimes think of it as a product, but it is. A food product is no different than an automobile. If you're driving down the highway and your automobile blows up, the manufacturer of that automobile is strictly liable. It means if you're a manufacturer and the product was unsafe, i.e. it blew up or fell out of the sky or has E. coli in it, that's an unsafe product. And did the product cause injury? If a child develops hemolytic uremic syndrome, has kidney failure, or if a child, is in a car that blows up, it just obviously causes injury. Strict liability is, what makes, in a sense, my job easy. Once I prove causation, it's really game over. Negligence is a little different concept. A good example would be a grocery store that sells an unopened can of peas. That grocery store will not be held responsible unless they knew or should have known of a problem with the can of peas, or if they dropped it and it swells and it has botulism in it. I mean, so grocery stores tend to, in most instances, not be responsible. Punitive damages, criminal liability, is something that we've seen more and more of. The first 20 years of my practice, we never saw a criminal case. In the last decade, we've seen, some significant fines of some major food companies, and we've seen people go to jail. Stuart Parnell from the Salmonella outbreak linked to peanut butter in 2009 is spending the next 28 years in prison. So it can be a pretty serious thing, including the lawsuits that I bring. Litigation is an incentive, and I'll tell this story very as quickly as I can about the Jack in the Box outbreak. There were 700 people sick through 5 states. 4 children died. About 75 children suffered acute kidney failure. So it was a significant outbreak. It's been one of the largest outbreaks of E. coli, certainly in the United States, and if not in the world. And it was a major pivot point in food safety in the United States. What's interesting, a couple things from a public health point of view, is why did this outbreak happen? Well, there are a couple of things. When we had small E. coli outbreaks, in fact, one linked to McDonald's in 1982 that got kind of swept under the rug. But E. coli 0157H7 was not a reportable disease in most states in 1992, 1993. The outbreak for Jack in the Box actually started in San Diego, which is the corporate headquarters for Jack in the Box. It started in November and December of 1992, but because it wasn't reportable, public health was flying blind. That's a lot similar today to what happened in the Coronabacter Sazaki cases of linked to infant formula and Abbott. The only 2 states in the country that Coronabacter is reportable is Michigan and Minnesota. So we really don't have any idea how large the scope of the problem is for Coronabacter in this country, because we don't look. And that's what happened in Jack in the Box. So there was an outbreak that didn't get reported. The meat got shipped to around the Western United States, and that outbreak essentially blew up in January of 1993. Another interesting fact is that in early 1992, the state of Washington, which had E. coli reportable, also had increased the cook temperature for hamburger from 140, which was the FDA food code requirement, to 155. They disseminated all that information out to restaurants in the state of Washington and to corporate headquarters that had restaurants in the state of Washington. So that information went out in 1992. During the course of discovery, after the outbreak happened, I obviously got a bunch of documents from Jack in the Box, and I started finding some really interesting things. When they had been denying that they knew about the increased cook temperatures, I started finding documents, in fact, that clearly implicated them in knowing. One of the ones, my favorite one, was this in the suggestion box that came from employees of Jack in the Box. And this one woman sent this in the suggestion box to corporate headquarters. I think regular patties should cook longer. They don't get done and we have customer complaints. Describe the benefit. If we change this, we'll be making our burgers done and edible. They wrote her back in July 1992, again, months before the outbreak. Dear Wendy, we'd like to acknowledge the time and effort you've taken to contribute to the success of Jack in the Box by enclosing this pen highlighter. I think they probably should have made her a vice president. What was really fascinating is that we got documents that actually showed that Jack in the Box in corporate headquarters tried to see if they could make their burgers done and edible, i.e. increase the cook temp from 140 to 155. And they wrote Wendy back after the test, we researched your suggestion and determined that with the variability of our grill temps, 350 to 400, the 2-minute cook time is appropriate. The 2-minute cook time is what became the most important thing. They're a fast food outlet. At 350, the hamburgers didn't cook to 155. At 400, they tended to do that. And there was a difference between old grills that tended to cook a little cooler and new grills that tended to cook a little hotter. It so happened that a lot of old grills were in the state of Washington. So it was a perfect storm. Highly contaminated, frozen patties with old grills. Boom, that outbreak happened. It took Jack in the Box a week after the outbreak blew up to increase their cook time from 2 minutes to 2 minutes and 15 seconds. 15 seconds could have saved hundreds of people, children from dying and children from having acute kidney failure. After Jack in the Box, one of the most important things that has ever happened in food safety is they deemed E. coli 015787 an adulterant. So prior to Jack in the Box, people could knowingly sell E. coli contaminated meat and do it with impunity. After 1994 and Mike Taylor, who had a stint both at FDA as well as FSIS, deemed them adulterant, it changed the game, that the meat companies couldn't sell it. Of course, the quotes from the industry are how unfair it is. It's the same refrain we hear from the industry today. They sued the USDA. Eventually they lost. And after, essentially a decade of fighting and me suing the meat industry multiple times, taking, close to $500 million from the meat industry, something happened. And the revenue at Marler Clark, which was like 95% of our revenue was E. coli cases linked to hamburger, has essentially disappeared. We still do a lot of work, a lot of E. coli cases, but it's completely shifted away from red meat. We just don't see outbreaks linked to hamburger anymore. And it's an incredible public safety victory. And I think, one that, a lot of people just don't talk about. And I talk about it all the time to industry when I speak to them, because many of these food safety problems that seem intractable or insoluble are actually solvable. Most of my work now is, romaine lettuce grown in either Salinas or California. It's an ongoing problem. It's not going to change. It appears that this spring seems to be quiet. But one of the things I think the people that watch this should know is that many outbreaks are never reported by the FDA, are never reported by the CDC, even ones that are clearly linked to a particular product, clearly linked to a particular supplier, restaurant, are swept under the rug. There are more outbreaks that happen where somebody's never identified. I wind up figuring them out myself over time. When people contact me and we do our investigation, and we uncover outbreaks that happen that maybe 30, 40, 100 people, the FDA, CDC haven't reported it at all. So sometimes you might think that, I haven't heard anything about this problem for a while. I guess everything's okay. Well, actually, it's because the government's not telling you that there's an ongoing problem. You can see by the trace back from the 2018 outbreak that it's incredibly complex. The romaine lettuce situation is incredibly complex in America, whether it's the Yuma or Arizona. I think the one thing, the industry has done a lot of things to try to fix the problem, but the one thing that both the government and industry just fail to touch is the farms. This is an actual aerial photo of Yuma, Arizona, the growing fields for lettuce, and they're right next to 100,000 cow CAFO. The water canal that you see next to it is the Welton Canal, which is where water comes from to irrigate the land. And believe me, I'm not a rocket scientist, probably none of the people listening to me are, but you don't have to be a rocket scientist to realize that E. coli 0157 comes from cattle feces. When you have 100,000 cows and you're growing this stuff next to lettuce fields that don't have a kill step, even washing lettuce isn't going to solve your problem. When you're growing it next to 100,000 CAFO, you got a problem. I'm going to wrap up by making a pitch to a book about the Jack in the Box case. It's a good read, not just because there's a bunch of pictures of me in my 30s, but it really is a good read. I think it gives people who don't know a lot about how foodborne illness outbreaks are conducted in investigations. It's a really good read for that, and it's I think a good tale about how serious these things can be. The book has been made into a documentary. It covers not just Jack in the Box, but sort of brings us up to date of problems in our chicken and salmonella and E. coli and lettuce and other outbreaks that have occurred over the last 30 years. Just premiered at Tribeca last Friday, and hopefully will be coming out on Netflix sometime this summer. With that, I hope I went through this fairly quickly, and I'm more than happy to answer any questions, and certainly more than happy to direct you to story ideas, because we all eat, and what happens to people who sometimes just do simple things of eating with their family and wind up in compromised situations is really sad. And I've been around long enough now to have a pretty good understanding of how the government and industry continue to fail us and our children. And so with that, Bar, I'm more than happy to answer whatever questions come at me.
Great. Thanks so much, Bill, for that. I really appreciate it. For our members out there who are watching, please go ahead and put your questions in that Q&A box, and I'll get started with some questions. Bill, actually, can you go back to that screen sharing and show
Sure.
that photograph again of the Yuma? Like, I was trying to make sense of how close the growing. Can you point out where the, and I know you've talked about this before, but like I was trying to understand where the,
Oops, let's see. Hold on a second.
because one of the issues here, right, is the water, the regulations governing water usage in farms that, so can you send your pointer to where the lettuce is growing?
Here are all the cows. Here's the
Those are all,
yeah, these are all cows for as far as you can see. This is the Welton Canal. This is one of the main water supplies for the growing region of Yuma. These are all lettuce fields and other leafy green, romaine lettuce and other leafy green fields that are growing quite close to, obviously, proximity to the cattle feedlot. One of the things that I think is super important to understand is, when the FDA was doing their investigation, they did find a genetic match, a whole genome sequence match of the E. coli in the water supply that was a match to the humans that got sick. But they were not allowed to go on to the feedlot to do testing on the feedlot. They were disallowed from going on there. There's no regulatory ability for them to go on and do testing. So one of the things that happens in most of these reports is that there's kind of this sort of ambiguous line at the end about what the root cause is. And, they just go, well, there's no clear evidence that it was from the cattle feedlot. And it's like, it's because you were not allowed to go on to the cattle feedlot and test. So yeah, does that answer your question?
Yeah, I mean, you have talked about how you really know the FDA extremely well, the USDA, kind of how this regulatory process works. Is there any indication that that is going to change at any point, anytime soon? Is this one of the big problems why our food supply is vulnerable?
Yeah, so it's kind of complex and some kind of complex, but quite simple. There is on the FDA side of the equation, there's an inability for FDA regulators and investigators to go on to the likely sources of contamination to leafy greens and other fruits and vegetables. They're not allowed to go on to what everyone knows is the most likely source, which is cattle feedlots, pigs and chicken areas. Also, too, on the USDA side of the equation, the USDA's authority stops at the slaughterhouse door. So they do not regulate and cannot regulate what happens at the farms, and like specifically with respect to poultry. USDA doesn't, do anything with respect to investigating what happens at broiler facilities or the egg manufacturers, egg growing entities. And that's where the salmonella occurs. By the time it hits the slaughterhouse, I don't care how many USDA inspectors are there. I don't care what you do, you're not going to solve the problem. It's too late. And so that's why we continue to have, an ongoing salmonella problem linked to poultry. Why, people in like my world of food safety, everyone handles chicken like it's radioactive. And, it's sort of like the same reason why food safety professionals don't eat sprouts. We sort of know too much. But yeah, it is a problem with government, lack of government oversight and the power of various industries, specifically farmers, to not get linked into these things. But ultimately, the source of foodborne illness in America is animal feces. That's where it comes from. And until we wrap our heads around that and deal with it, we're going to continue to have this problem. And my accountant is going to be continued to be very happy.
Well, on that vein, what tips can journalists give consumers about what to do with this knowledge that you're sharing with us? What questions should they be asking?
Well, so, there Center for Science in the Public Interest, which is, there's very few consumer, one of the frustrating things for me is there's very few consumer groups that, are on the ground in DC with the bandwidth to attack appropriately, the industry's sort of stuff. Center for Science and Public Interest has been around for a long time. They have a good food service and food safety person in Sarah Socher. They have a bill that would allow FDA inspectors onto farms in outbreak situations, which I think it's a step. It's not a full-on step, but it's a step. And so that's a good thing. Safe Table is our priority, or it's called Stop Foodborne Illness. That's another good group. They just don't have a lot of bandwidth in DC. And so we're really at a loss. And I think where journalists can help is to tell these stories, to make these stories of what happens to these people real, and then ask, industry and ask, Congress members, what the heck are you doing to solve this problem? And the reality is, for the most part, the problems that we have today are the same problems that we had 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago. The mix may change, the type of food that's causing the problem may change, but essentially the numbers that you gave out early, those are the same numbers that from 25 years ago. They change a little bit of what product is the vector. And so, my view is that Congress members and senators have not been held to account for their lack of oversight on this. I mean, Food Safety Modernization Act was signed by Obama in 2011. Many of those provisions, the water rule, traceability, many of those things are still not done. And it's 13 years later, 12 years later. And, I don't think that, I don't think we do enough to hold, to account, the administration, to push this stuff. Sometimes it gets, like the infant formula issue was big enough and political enough that it, I think, may have changed a little bit of the infrastructure. And, as I told you earlier this morning, I was pleasantly surprised to see in a House Appropriations bill for the FDA, a specific requirement for the FDA to rearrange its deck chairs on their Titanic. And so, I find some hope that at least some staffer, slid that in, and it appears to have passed.
Yeah, I want to get back to the meaning of that, but I want to continue on this question of, like, if I'm writing a story, a consumer story about with awareness, you mentioned those in food safety don't eat sprouts.
Right.
What tips can you give to when you're shopping, what to think about? Do you tell your family members, like, don't buy that?
No. It's funny. Funny story. Years ago, I was being interviewed by some BBC reporter on something, and at the end, some horrible outbreak, and then she goes, "My God, what do you eat?" And I'm like, "Well, it's probably better to tell you what I don't eat." And so I gave her a list of the things I don't eat, and I thought that was kind of the end of it. And then I got a text from my daughter, which is how my daughters communicate with me. And I got a text from my daughter. She's, "Dad, you're going viral." And so apparently the 6 things that Bill Marler doesn't eat has been circumnavigating the world fairly frequently over the last decade. But, raw juices, raw milk, there's no reason, especially for children, to be exposed to that. It's just too dangerous. Undercooked meat,
Any
hamburger,
kind of meat, right?
any kind of, yeah, and any kind of meat, especially chicken. It's a lot safer today. Again, I can't underscore how crazy it is that if you go back and you look from like mid 90s to first part of 2000, it's E. coli outbreak after E. coli outbreak linked to hamburger. It's recall, 500,000 pounds, 10 million pounds, 30 million pounds of meat being recalled. It was a weekly, monthly occurrence. Boom, boom, boom. That's nothing anymore. That doesn't mean you can go to the grocery store, buy a pound of hamburger and eat it raw. That would be a bad idea. But it's safer today. You don't have to be worried. Bill Marler eats hamburgers, still to 155. Well done. But I eat hamburger. Chicken, I do eat chicken, but I handle it when I cook it like it's a nuclear waste thing. So, undercooking meat is not something Bill Marler does. I tend to stay away from raw oysters. I know that you'll get probably lots of comments like I'm some kind of communist because of that. But the reality is that with global warming, we're seeing more and more and more outbreaks linked to raw oysters. And there's a recent recall, like just in the last day or so, where there's illnesses in Minnesota and Hawaii linked to Korean oysters. So, these are ongoing things. Sprouts. Don't eat sprouts. Under any circumstances, don't eat sprouts. They're just too risky. They'll make you sick. And it's because they're sprouted by seeds, which are grown outside. They get contaminated. Then you put them in a bath where you sprout them in a perfect environment for bacterial growth. The other thing that may be a little uncomfortable for people is I don't eat bag salads. All of the outbreaks that I have been involved in linked to romaine lettuce and other leafy greens have been triple washed, chopped, processed, bagged salads. And I tell people maybe it's a pain, but buy a head of lettuce, take the outer leaves off and wash the rest. The likelihood of you getting sick from that is incredibly low. Doesn't,
Why is that less
I'll give-
than if you get
yeah,
a
so
triple wash
I'll give
container
you-
or bag?
I'll give you an example. 2006 spinach outbreak out of Salinas, California. We were able to link it to one 20-acre spinach farm that all of the spinach was cut and processed on that day. There had been some wild pig intrusions into the field, which was the most likely source of the E. coli. But the pigs didn't do their business on every leaf of spinach. But when you processed it all together at once, and you washed it, and the manure and the chlorine, overwhelmed themselves, and you got in bags, and then you shipped it across the country. Crazily enough, the same lot went to California and also went to the Midwest. There were a handful of cases of sick people in California. Most of the cases were in the Midwest that got sick. Took a day or two to get across the country. Perfect environment for that E. coli to sort of perk in that bag. 250 people sick, 5 dead, about 50 people with acute kidney failure. So as I've said repeatedly, convenience sometimes just is not worth the risk.
Mm-hmm. And there's some other things. I quickly looked up what were the 6 things I saw. Raw or undercooked eggs. You already said oysters, raw shellfish, pre-washed fruits and vegetables. Meat
Pre-cut. So I've had, one of the things, Listeria, which kills about, Coronabacter Sazaki is a nasty bug, will kill like 50% of the people it infects. Listeria hits about a third of the people, 25% to a third it'll kill you, especially if you're elderly, immune compromised, or you're pregnant. And where we see them is showing up in cut fruits and vegetables. It's a great source for Listeria to grow, as well as deli meats and cheeses. And so that's why, they tell women who are pregnant to avoid many of those products, because they could be deadly to to yourself and to your child.
Mm-hmm. What about cookie dough is one that I've seen.
No,
recently.
I know that's just, I know it's going to drive people nuts, but we've seen more and more. I mean, everything is kind of a moving target based on, a lot of times, because of better and newer science. There probably were outbreaks linked to flour in the past. I think most people think that, outbreaks of cookie dough are problematic because of eggs, and they were 25 years ago, 30 years ago. But frankly, the USDA and FDA have done a pretty good job of driving down the amount of salmonella that are in shelled eggs. So we're seeing, and a lot of the manufacturers are using pasteurized egg products in pre-made products. But flour has been a growing problem, and probably growing not necessarily because they weren't happening in the past, but people just didn't think about them as what a source is. But I'm involved in an outbreak in France, where 52 children have developed hemolytic uremic syndrome. 2 children have died. In France, they don't count the non-HUS cases. So essentially, that France is having an outbreak about the size of Jack in the Box, linked to Nestle pizzas. And the most likely source was the flour dough that sickened these people. So yeah, that's another thing to worry about, another reason why no one ever invites Bill Marler to dinner. So
Well, I saw the gold flour recall for salmonella.
yeah.
Um, eh, just again, sort of trying to help journalists to help consumers in terms of questions to ask. So you list these foods, really think about it, maybe have a skeptical eye about those. But are there questions you can ask, like looking for certain places, like food grown here or there, or certain brands? What else can consumers do to educate themselves when they're at the store to like look at where something is made? Like any other thoughts on that?
So, you know, we obviously are importing a lot more food into the United States than we did 30 years ago. But as someone who's been involved in lots of cases, I don't see necessarily that imported food products are a significantly higher risk than products grown in the United States. There are certain kinds of bugs that tend not to be in US food products, hepatitis A being one. Hepatitis A is endemic everywhere else in the world. And so we've seen recently outbreaks and recalls linked to hepatitis A linked to strawberries from Mexico. We've certainly seen cyclospora outbreaks linked to fresh basil from Mexico and Guatemala. Certainly, a variety of, tropical fruits have been contaminated with salmonella. I mean, from a consumer's perspective, you gotta play defense. You gotta, wash things thoroughly. You gotta keep cold things cold and hot things hot. You gotta wash your hands. You gotta wash your cutting boards. And keeping things simple. I think, keeping things more local if you can. But that's not something that everyone can do. We've got, when you layer all this, food safety stuff, maybe it's easier for, upper income people to play that game. But we have obviously food deserts where people don't necessarily have those choices. And that's really why we need, better regulation and better responsibility on the behalf of consumers and having industry paying attention to the things that make us sick. So I think probably playing defense. The FDA, USDA uses the separate, chill, cook and clean. And I think we just need to kind of keep reminding ourselves, especially if you have children, especially if you're pregnant, especially if you're older than 65 or have an immune compromised system. You got to play the odds and play it safe.
And one more question related to this, and we'll get to the regulatory side of things again. What about organic? Is organic any safer?
So the only difference between organic and non-organic is the use of pesticides, herbicides. Those are things that might kill you in the long run. It's the bacteria and viruses that'll kill you in the short run. And really, there's no difference between organic versus non-organic when it comes to risks of bacterial or viral contamination. So, just eating organic isn't going to save you from E. coli. In fact, many times people use organic as sort of a get out of jail free card on food safety. They say, oh, it's organic, it's got to be safe, or oh, it's local, I bought it at my farmer's market, it's got to be safe. Well, no. You still have to use the kinds of cautions that I described. Having that said, you can get sick from locally grown products, you can get sick from organic products. but, it's the closer you are to, growing your own food to the extent that's possible. It's not with zero risk, but the closer you are to the product being produced and grown, more likely than not, the product is less likely to make you sick. It's not completely that way. I mean, that gets back to like raw milk. A lot of people think, well, oh, I can't stand mass produced food, so I'm going to start doing organic. Well, if my organic farmer, sells at Walmart, so I'm not going to do that. Well, now I have a farmer that, lives down the street and will sell me raw milk. That must be great for my kids. And then you feed it to them and they wind up dying, and that would be a bad thing. So, I think consumers, if there's one thing that reporters and all of us could do is become, more science-based, which is difficult, and is getting more difficult because science has become politicized over the last decade. And, if you believe in science, you're in one camp. If you don't believe in science, you're in another camp. And it's a challenge.
Well, let's go to the regulatory side of it. And you kind of alerted me something newsy just a little while ago, which is that the House Appropriations can be directed the FDA to figure out how to remove food.
Yeah, big
It's
deal.
right. Can you talk about the significance of that, and how would somebody pitch the story idea to their editor? Because they might be, wherever they're at, trying to, how do you explain to your editor, no, this is important, this is newsy. Like,
I certainly, as a publisher of a newspaper, and by the way, I'll just real quickly, I'm the publisher at Food Safety News, but the 4 reporters who work there work unfettered by, me telling them what to do. In fact, hell, half the time I never talk to them. And they do a great job, and I'm really happy that they're doing their things, and I'm happy to provide that as a service. But as it relates to, this new FDA thing, this kind of goes back to, there's always been a problem at the FDA about, you got the commissioner of food and drugs, and usually that commissioner is a medical doctor that comes out of the drug field. Food has always sort of been, the red-haired stepchild of the FDA. The drugs get all the money, FDA, doesn't. And they it's not that they don't get anything, but it's just not, robust. And that's with food safety when it comes to things that'll kill you quickly, or human nutrition, the things that'll kill us long term, heart disease, diabetes, and those things. There's always been talk about sort of splitting the agency in some form. But the impetus for what's happening now really came about because of the infant formula crisis. The FDA was completely asleep at the switch. Kids got sick, 2 died. And then when the FDA forced Abbott to recall all the product, then we had no infant formula on the shelves. It became a huge scandal in the Biden administration, deservedly so, and deservedly so at the FDA. And I think that's what's prompted the scrutiny. And the FDA tried to kick the can down the road by having a commission of the Reagan-Udall Commission. I actually was one of the people that testified in front of it. I advocated a complete split where you had a commissioner of food and nutrition, human nutrition, and a commissioner of, drugs and medical devices. What the House Appropriations Committee has required FDA to do is not quite that far, but it's to have a empowered food associate commissioner that's in charge of essentially all the levers of food safety and food policy at the FDA. That's a big deal, and I think over time will, help have everybody know who is in fact responsible for food safety, both products that'll kill you quickly or kill you long term. And I think, perhaps the hook is, people who struggled through the infant formula thing, locally, and there's lots of those folks. And to then put this in context and, the people that stop, the people at Center for Science and the Public Interest, have, great spokespeople to talk about it. Brian Ronholm at Consumer Reports is a great source. So yeah, no, I think that to me, I think it's a timely story and probably in the context of the infant formula, make it, sort of palatable for every reporter in every community.
Well, we're right at our 12:45 mark, so I really appreciate your time here, Bill, with us, and want to let everyone know that if you have any more questions, you can follow up with me or Bill. I know he'd be happy to talk with you, and want to wish everyone good luck with the reporting. This is one in a series of webinars that we produce for our members to help us with our coverage. Wishing you a great rest of your afternoon.
Great. Thanks so very much.